Welcome back to Breathtaking, where because today is the 30th anniversary of the Americans with Disabilities Act, we will be honoring the quest for disability rights all week. Because many of you may be unaware of what life was like before the ADA was signed into law, I'll be reading a few excerpts today from A People's History of the Independent Living Movement, a monograph I wrote in 1988, 2 years before the ADA existed. Here is excerpt 1. Part of what keeps America alive is her ability to recall. Even though we were not there, we all know stories about Valley Forge, Gettysburg, and Selma. When we hear or relate these stories, both listener and teller are enlightened, even energized by them. Without those stories, American history and American pride wouldn't be the same. America needs her stories. This monograph contains stories that should make America proud. They are stories of the independent living movement and its leaders, dedicated to the notion that people with disabilities belong in the community, not the convalescent home, are neither patients to be cured, children to be taken care of, nor brave souls to be admired, should be in charge of the assistance they may require, that is, free to be independently dependent, and are victimized by a prejudiced society, not the disabilities they happen to have. Like all stories, these stories have heroes. A hero in this context is someone who fights for equal rights and, in the process, makes a dent in history. The word is not used, as it often is in print or on film, to connote a, quote, courageous cripple who threw away his wheelchair, unquote, or a, quote, sightless wonder who actually graduated at the top of her class, unquote. Some of these heroes, such as Ed Roberts, Judy Heumann, Justin Dart, have appeared in newspapers nationwide. Others are less famous. All of them made a dent in history. Here is excerpt number 2, A Metamorphosis That Made History. It's about Ed Roberts, considered by many to be the founder of the disability rights movement. Roberts' earliest recollection of disability takes him to a day in 1946 when, like many 6-year-olds, he heard his father say, "Don't stare," when a woman with cerebral palsy came into view. At 13, his prejudices against people with disabilities were well entrenched. At 14, he contracted polio. Roberts reminisces, "I was a very independent kid. Suddenly, I became a patient. My mother was told I'd become a vegetable because of my high fever. The doctors told her it would be better if I died. Meanwhile, I was experiencing lots of self-hatred and powerlessness. I was a helpless cripple, dependent on an iron lung. I absorbed all the stereotypes. I would never marry, have a job, or be a whole person. I tried to starve myself, the only way to commit suicide. In 7 months, my weight dropped from 120 to 50 pounds. Fortunately, when the last home nurse quit, Roberts started eating again. Still, he stayed home for 5 years, afraid to be seen by those who had no disability, ashamed to be seen around those who did. The turning point came when, after years of high school by telephone, Roberts completed his senior year. There was nothing left to do but get out of the house. My worst fear came true, he recalls. Everyone stared. But that experience created a shift in my own perception. I decided if people wanted to stare, it was their problem, not mine. A mediocre student before the onset of polio, Roberts excelled over the telephone wires. I began to realize that the key to power was education. Ironically, his high school principal thought ignition was the key that mattered. He maintained that Roberts couldn't graduate because he had not taken driver education. You wouldn't want a cheap diploma, the principal intoned. Roberts and his mother threw the principal out of the house. With the help of a family friend on the community school board, Roberts got his high school diploma. It was a very important fight for me, he said, because I won. I learned that you must fight for your own rights, no matter what people say. And I learned it's important to turn to the media if necessary. Turning to the media became necessary 2 years after the diploma victory. California's Department of Rehabilitation, rejecting Roberts as, quote, too disabled to work, refused to sponsor his university education. Roberts contacted the press. Within a week, the Department of Rehabilitation caved in. After earning an associate degree at the College of San Mateo, Roberts applied to the University of California at Berkeley. His application was accepted, but he was not. We've tried cripples and it didn't work, said the Dean of Students, explaining that there was no place on campus for a student with an iron lung. Robert spent much of his time on his back, but he did not take this verdict lying down. Finally, Berkeley's Student Health Center director said that Roberts could treat the campus's hospital like a dormitory, coming and going as he pleased. Through California's Aid to the Totally Disabled program, he and his fellow disabled students hired, trained, and fired their own attendants. They were independently dependent. Here is the third excerpt, Simultaneous Struggles. It would be simplistic to attribute an entire movement to the goings-on in one college town. As Berkeley's ripple effect spread, news of similar and simultaneous struggles for equality and dignity reached the East Coast. A nationwide disability rights network was springing up. In New York, in 1970, a conference at a smaller university campus spawned an organization called Disabled in Action. DIA's co-founder, a graduate of Brooklyn's Long Island University, was Judy Heumann. Heumann's final shift toward political activism took place at age 25, but by that time, the struggle for equality had been a part of her life for 20 years. Denied admission to public school because her wheelchair was, quote, a fire hazard, she saw her parents fight that injustice for 4 years. Her first victory was switching from home instruction to a segregated health conservation class. When she saw how little her teachers were doing, Heumann began to teach reading skills to her classmates. There was a lot to accomplish at Long Island University. When Heumann made arrangements to live on campus, the dormitory director pressured Heumann's attendant-to-be to turn down her job. The attendant was told she'd be held responsible if Heumann fell. Incensed, Heumann called LIU's president and was admitted to the dorm. In the face of obstacles like these, Heumann and several others pressured LIU to establish its Disabled Students program. At 22, diploma in hand, Heumann applied for a New York City Board of Education teaching license. She passed the oral and written exams, but the board declared her unqualified. The reason? She could not walk. A lawsuit followed. Heumann won the case and began teaching at her former elementary school. That was the final excerpt from A People's History of the Independent Living Movement. But I'm closing this podcast with exciting news. I'm delighted to announce that Judy Heumann will be joining us here on Breathtaking in approximately 1 month for a 3-part conversation about the quest for disability rights. Please join me tomorrow for part 2 of our celebration of disability rights.